Never miss our updates and be part of our conversation squad.
Good morning, friends. Good morning, and welcome back. Welcome back to Manthan, and welcome back to Manthan online after a long time. Uh, we have been away, and we were enjoying the online sessions for a while, but we thought that we'll go back to in-person sessions, and we did a few last year. But here today, we have a very interesting and very topical issue about the rise of the right-wing populism in India, Russia, Brazil, and Turkey. We have Professor Deepanshu Mohan. Deepanshu is a professor of economics and the director of the Center of New Economic Studies at the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. He's also a visiting professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies. But more important, today, he is the co-author of a very good book. In fact, I would recommend that you should buy the book, Strongman Saviors, A Political Economy of the Populism in India, Turkey, Russia, and Brazil. Deepanshu will be having a conversation after a presentation with Abhinav. Abhinav Padmanabhan was a senior research assistant at the Center for New Economic Studies at the Jindal School. He just told us that he's on a sabbatical. He's also the lead editor for the Journal for Conversations in Development Studies and a co-author on the Strongman Saviors. Strongmen are now currently popular, and I think they're combining both in this, what promises to be a very interesting presentation. And we will have a discussion after the presentation. Deepanshu, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ram, and thank you, Vikram, for the opportunity to engage with the audience at Manthan. I mean, a lot of us have been following the seminars and the discussions that Manthan has been organizing, and particularly during the pandemic, there were a few sessions that were done that I've personally recommended to many students across different courses that I've been taking and teaching, particularly the lecture by Pratap sir and Ratin Roy on the Indian economy and the political contract in which we're seeing a lot of shifts. So the book has, a lot of its research embedded, and I'm just, one of you can just confirm if you can see the presentation. Abhinav, we can see the presentation all right? So
yeah, we can.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is give you a sense of not just what the book is about, but also the conceptual framework under which the book was, a book's research back in 2018, somewhere around 2018, December is when where a bunch of students at the center and myself were involved in a conversation on what's really happening at the global political economy landscape, and why that the whole narrative or discussion around strongman leadership or the rise of populism and a distinct wave defining extreme sort of populist tendencies on the ideological spectrum of what is called as the sort of political ideological right was gripping much of the global economy. But much of the literature and analysis was focused on what was happening in Europe and North America. And so much of the literature was also developing with Trump's presidential victory in the US, and then sort of the switch to what was happening in parts of Eastern, Western Europe. And at the same time, much of the other regions were not unaffected by this phenomenon. In fact, we have had in Southeast Asia and South Asia, perhaps, the emergence of populist movements at successive or different regular intervals at different periods of time in much of the 20th and 21st century. So it's nothing as if when we can say that it's only now that you're seeing that there is a rise of a certain kind of a charismatic cult personality driven leadership, which is backed by an ideological movement or backing. I mean, with the Indian scenario, we say that it's nothing much new. What's happening in Turkey, Russia, and perhaps Brazil is something that was grabbing our attention at the same time. And that's why we thought that it might be good to look at the comparative political economy of populism in case of these countries, which are strategically important actors within their own region. So just for the benefit of everyone who's sort of signed in or logged in, what we wanted to do was to outline the talk around three areas, and Abhinav would sort of talk a lot more about the case studies that we have in the book. But I wanted to also take this opportunity to draw out what would be a key conceptual axis, which in a certain sense is raising more questions than providing answers to what's happening really around the world. At the same time, the axes of contestations, as we would like to call it, is something which is deeply embedded in the way we define a lot of the terms. And I'll sort of shortly talk about what that means. For students, scholars of political science, economics, sociology, and to a certain extent, the intersections of these fields with other fields of social science and humanities like anthropology, psychology, literature. I mean, most of these intersections and intersectionalities right now, I would say this perhaps this period of time is most fascinating for us to really go beyond the prescribed formulae of research methodology and areas where we can work, because much of what's happening right now, it's been called the age of polycrisis somehow, is not well studied or captured by the existing methodological frameworks that were dominant for much of the mid 20th and late 20th century. But there are certain classical frameworks which still stand the test of time, and we use some of those in the way we analyze the case studies identified in our book. So what I'll do is to start off, give you a sense of what this conceptual axis is, or this axis of contestations, we call it, is. When we use the term populism, the ism as part of the populist discourse gives you a meaning or a contextual relevance to something which is not defined in a universalist framework, which is to say that there is no one set definition that you can perhaps use to define populism. And I say this because much of the literature and the different definitions that scholars have come up with have all been embedded in the social, political, and economic context in which they're studying the phenomenon. And it's right to call it a phenomenon because it's sort of embedded in the times in which you're studying that, right? So yes, there are certain common parallels and identity-based markers that one can look at and sort of extrapolate those for your research, but there is no set definition so as to speak on how you can call or define populism. At the same time, there are contestations that you would find within populism and its relationship with much of what's happening around the world at this point of time, or perhaps you can go back to the past and see these forces entwined with much of the discussion around populism. And that's why we call this the axis of contestations. I mean, you don't have a very set understanding of what hyperglobalism and the wave towards supply-side economics, push towards liberalization, privatization, globalization. That was the mantra of the 90s, post-Washington consensus, the new neoliberal order of the sort of the World Bank, IMF pushed ideological spectrum, created its own sort of discontents. And scholars like Danny Roderick and many others were arguing about this in the mid or early 90s itself. Hajun Chuang wrote recently a piece about economics and why we should all learn a little bit of economics, because there is a huge dominance of one sort of ideological mainstream spectrum. And what's happened with globalization and hyperglobalism has made things to be much more crowded and sort of contested as we speak now. The same goes with discussions around authoritarianism and populism. And sometimes when we're talking about a leader like Vladimir Putin, Putin's way of functioning would sort of, as a strongman, would give you more evidence of an authoritarian leader. But as Abhinav would sort of expand later on, he does check a lot of boxes which you would see are part of a populist leadership as well. And the Russian political system allows that entwinement of populist leadership along with an authoritarian system of governance. In India, we're seeing a wave of majoritarianism, which is, I think, perhaps unprecedented to the way of what we can have, or we could see in post-independent India's economic and political history. And the extent of that is now sort of with every day, we're getting much more of evidence on how the targeted persecution of minorities or certain social groups is at the center of much of the administrative, operative, and functioning of the state. And at the period of time, this is also coming with trademarks of populist strongman leadership. And finally, perhaps the link between populism and welfarism also tells us why a certain kind of populism is likely to succeed, which is to say that it's not as if that wherever you have evidence of populist strongman leadership, everywhere you see only a similar sort of a trajectory in power. And there is evidence of smaller countries, or in fact, like Cambodia, periods of time in Indonesia's political history, or in case of, let's say, states like Odisha, West Bengal, where you can have a populist leader in power, but if you establish a welfare state, that is, you have social security and other welfare notions well established, you can sustain on having power for a longer period of time. So with those contestations at the backdrop, we're trying to sort of caution you that it would be inaccurate or to interpret or understand populism in any one given definitive form. Having said that, in the book also, we have talked about different definitions that have been put ahead by scholars from Klaus Modern to Goodwin about what populism means, where and how or what features or characteristics of a populistic movement may be defined as. So to give you a very simple understanding, a populistic movement would have, first of all, a focus on a given leader. We're not talking about parties and processes within the parties that are creating certain kind of leaders in power. And a populist leader would not be constrained by perhaps organizational rules or will have, in other words, sort of a total control of personnel, strategic decision-making within the organization. And the main characteristic that one sort of sees where a populist movement is different from other kinds of movements or phenomenon is the case of mobilization of masses towards achieving certain political ends backed by ideological meanings. The framework or the way in which we are looking at populism in this book or research, you'll find is largely drawn from much of the literature that's emerged in ideological populism. So there are tranches and, in other words, sections and stratums of how populisms or different kind of isms have developed over a period of time. So the one which we are most closely converging our analytical framework with is the unchecked, sort of unabated rise of an ideology, the marginalization of, let's say, certain targeted communities or moderate factions, and in the development of a cult personality, which is what is causing that strongman, larger-than-life rhetorical access for leaders to come into power. There is no one normative political ideological spectrums to see this from. What I mean by that is we don't have in the book only emphasis on, okay, what is called as right-wing populism. We're also going back into the history of each of the countries that we have studied. And we've said that, for example, in India, we did have a left-wing populist tendency of a certain kind of leadership that we saw under Indira Gandhi. And there were certain tendencies of centralization of power, loss of agency in sort of state-citizen contract, lesser transparency, accountability, space for opportunities for more corruption, many things that were seen under a different kind of, and if you look at the history of much of Latin America, post the Great Depression, you see phases and periods of time where left-wing ideological axis has dominated the populist notion. So what we're trying to understand is what we're seeing now, which is a distinct wave of the rise of right-wing populism. And with that, I think I come to the sort of one of the most important parts of what we would sort of want to focus on in our talk today, which is some of the distinct characteristics of what we're seeing now. And what we're trying to do here is to give you just a peek and a sense of an evolving pyramid, perhaps, of key features or characteristics of the contemporary waves of populism that we're seeing. You can call this right wing, or you can call it different, whatever wing of populism that you can want to characterize as. But there's something interesting what we're seeing now, which I don't think that we've seen before in much of what even the literature talks about. And the first sort of the key access point of that is a lot we are seeing now has emerged from the source of discontents that were laid by the application of supply side economic reforms in much of the late 80s or 90s, depends on the country's own sort of move towards a pro-market or pro-business economic reform seeking trajectory. Many communities, as a result of this sort of shift in policymaking spectrum, saw the opportunity or upward mobility of economic resources or social resources or social opportunities to be lacking. And that created a lot of problems and issues, clearly. The second key point, which we sort of talk about also in the book, is the fact that there's a rise in religious conservatism. I mean, some may say that from some kind of a moral, spiritual vacuum, which is now almost centered to the populist movement. In fact, for each of the leaders to stay in power, whether it's Modi, whether it's Erdogan, whether it's Bolsonaro till the time he was in power, and for Putin to do what he's doing with the war against Ukraine, you'd need a certain kind of backing of support, which is being made by the orthodox religious conservative space. And that sort of is really which is behind their rise and sustenance in power. Those forces of rise in religious conservatism may have, in some cases like Turkey, preceded the rise of a particular leader's political trajectory. But we do have evidence where we can say that the explicit focus on religious fundamentalism and making people to believe in a certain kind of religious identity as being the center of ideological mobilization is very core at the campaign of each of these leaders. The third key point, which is what we discuss in the book, so the three things we are looking largely at is discontents of neoliberal supply-side economic policies, rise in religious conservatism, and the trigger point, which we call it, which is the anti-corruption narrative, which allowed, a challenge to the status quo of the ruling political and business elite. It developed resentment against the status quo and against the existing class of leadership. And you saw with each of the case studies we look at, from India to Turkey to Brazil to Russia, there was a certain kind of resentment which was developing against the ruling elite, which allowed an alternative form of imagination of power, or a person to come from the back shadows and say that, oh, well, I'm the answer to all your problems. And the anti-corruption movements have really aided the rise of strongman leadership. With those 3 points at the backdrop, which are more analytically focused and studied upon in a work in the book, there are other key factors that we want to highlight here, which are, as the research has evolved, this is a project in the last 4 years, so We're humbled by the kind of developments that are more centered to what you saw during the pandemic, the period after that, which is also true. There is a certain alternative imagination of power that we are seeing, where rule of law is being substituted much in a certain sense by rule by law. And most of these strongman leaders believe in that. In sort of Hindi, you can sort of call it the Gita of Shakti, or Shakti ki Gita, where rule by law would have its own sort of meaning and relevance. And in such kind of a order, justice and law by its own sort of transcendental meaning would be seen as distant cousins. They won't sort of be on talking terms. We just had, I don't know for who was watching the news, but a sort of a radical killing of a person, two people in judicial custody, documented in camera. So it says a lot about what we are sort of getting into as a country. There's a striking chord with each of these strongman leaders, with the low-income groups that tend to support them, not just electorally, but also in terms of giving them the confidence that they can sustain power. And that's where I was saying that the link between welfarism and populism is striking. You have, for example, a prime minister who would continue extending a plan of free ration for a certain targeted group of community members, even way after the pandemic, because it's clearly something which helps strike a chord, thinking that you have the confidence of these voters with you. There's the weaponization of social media institutions that we are seeing now, which is in the entrance of a new sort of a neo 1984 or post new information order built by surveillance capitalism. And while we have not discussed some of these points in the book per se, but we're cognizant that these are forces that are gravitationally sort of operating to move and define the wave of populism that we are seeing now. And the pro-business state capital nexus, the sort of the Adani Modi, Ambani Modi combined, you have an ideological convergence which is very essential for state proximity. And again, it's not something which is restricted only to India, because sort of talking about this here in context to Manthan, I'm using more examples from the South Asian scenario, but you see evidence of this in Turkey, Brazil, and Russia as well. The two last, I think, key points that I want to sort of leave you with on this particular slide is the fact that the gendered perspective of talking about strong men is also explained by how the leaders themselves and those following the leaders see or imagine sort of looking at gender in a certain way, or women in a certain way, as care providers, mothers, and not as equal citizens who would share those kind of agency and rights with them. And this is interesting because if you would see the resistance to strongman leadership that has emerged in form of different regimes, including countries like where you see religious orthodoxy at its highest, Iran, Afghanistan, the most of the protest movements in the last few years have been led by women as well. It's nothing too different to sort of observe, because of the sort of the targeted persecution of different, not just religious, but also social groups, and women have been sort of at the center of that attack, and members of the LGBTQ community as well. And finally, the behavior of the elite, and the fact that we sort of talk about this in the book as well, is that there is, in the attack of the status quo on the ruling elite, which each of the leaders wanted to do in their electoral campaign, you saw that a new form of thinking emerged in what kind of an elite citizenry should be part of. So the new business elite or the new political elite is very different, or is ideologically more convergent to the ruling state as against to what we could see before. So people would sort of subscribe to investment only when that they are on the same page with the ideological leanings of what those in ruling party or leadership mean. And as a result of that, you see that a lot of the private investment patterns is also changing. Investments are going a certain kind of popular imagination. You see that with cinema, you see that with other areas. So there's a certain changing behavior of what elite behavior could be defined under the current wave of populism. So With that, I mean, we come back to this pyramid, but this is at the sort of the core of what is happening in the last few years. In Western countries, you saw this happening post 2007 and 8 financial crisis. But in much of what you would see in the case studies we've identified, in case of India, you see this shift happening much so in 2010 and post that. But period of time where Modi really comes in power and sort of splits his agenda is 2013 and 2014. In Turkey's case, you see a different timeline of the 90s, where Erdogan is sort of gaining prominence. Same goes for Russia. And Brazil, you see that again in the post-2014 period. With that, what I want us to do is sort of, because I've already talked about what we're doing in the book, that is, we're talking about the 3 key factors of discontents of supply-side economics or neoliberalism, the trigger factor of anti-corruption movement, and the rise of religious conservatism. In theme factors, we are studying more in detail and length across the case studies we've looked at. But I've also highlighted other factors from the pyramid, which are also characteristic to the way strongman populism is being defined. There are certain limitations in the book, which I think we should all. It's a book which is written during the pandemic. In fact, much of the research was based on secondary literature of the history of each of the countries' political and social history. At the same time, we did some focus group discussions with scholars working around these themes and areas within the universities and institutions across these countries. There was a plan to visit both Brazil and Turkey for primary research, but that couldn't happen because of the pandemic and the restrictions of travel and mobility that were imposed, which I think made the research for us to focus and rely on a certain kind of critical discourse analysis, much more so that we would have otherwise preferred. Having said that, the language in which we are sort of communicating, of course, it's English, but also the literary focus in especially case studies from Russia and Turkey is also looking at much of what literature was published in English. So there is a homolinguistic focus in the review of literature that we have done, which we understand may have certain limitations for defining what we're doing. But let's look at most of the analysis and the broader trends rather than for the specifics of what they're trying to say. I'm trained mostly in ethnographic work now. In the last sort of 7-8 years, the center's work is also focused on ethnographic studies. So I'm well aware that localized indigenous socio-political contexts are so important in the way we define and understand state-citizen relationship. Having said that, this is a text in comparative political economy. So we are taking a more bird's eye view as against a worm's eye perspective. But if you'll see from the bird's eye and the worm's eye perspective, there will be mapping of things that you can clearly find as you read through the book and this research. We'll come back to the similarities later on, but for now, let me just ask Abhinav to go ahead and talk a little bit about each of the case studies and the factors you've studied in detail. Abhinav, please.
Thank you, sir. So the first thing that we notice is the role of maybe economic liberalization. What we see is the period of the late 20th century be an era where all these countries go through their own experiments with liberalization methods. All of them are very unique and all of them are very different. What this eventually results in is an empowered middle class and also affects the demographics of the country. It also results in an increase in urban migration. This migration in conjunction with the rise of a new educated and earning middle class changed the social environments of the urban spaces, which until then was dominated by the urban, upper echelons of the society. This change enabled the middle class to become significant voices in their country's politics, hence paving a way for a change in the composition of not just the country in itself, but the country's politics as well. The first country that we look at is India. So maybe we can move on to the next slide. Yeah. So what we can see is that the implementation of liberalization methods are significantly rising since the 1980s. The major motivation for this was the country was running twin deficits since the 1970s. As observed in the graph, we can see the graph depicts the gross fiscal deficit and the current account deficit as percentages. A major facilitator of liberalization in the 1980s was the Rajiv Gandhi government. They oversaw partial attempts at liberalization of the economic policies. These measures included liberalization of the economic policies, loosening of domestic industrial controls, and a reduction of import quotas and tariffs and taxes as well. However, this did not ease India's economic concerns, and India in 1991 had to go with further economic liberalization methods under the PV Narasimha Rao government. The highlight of this experiment was that the rupee was floated, there was free flow of foreign capital, public sector units were privatized, and quantitative restrictions on imports were removed, amongst other things. Now, moving on to Turkey, Turkey in a very similar manner to India was also experiencing major changes in the 1980s under Turgut Özal, who was the then prime minister and also president. He was also someone who worked at the World Bank prior to becoming a member of active politics within Turkey. So as part of his liberalization methods, he liberalized the capital account. He removed restriction on inflows and outflows of capital. He introduced a foreign exchange deposit account and the exchange rate to the Turkish currency as well. The introduction of foreign exchange accounts reduced demand for domestic currency, resulting in an increased inflation, and Turkey's condition actually worsened. What we can see through the graph is that the period of 90s was of very high inflation, something that we can see even today as well. Now, moving on to Russia, the Russian Federation is a little different from the other countries that we look at, because we're looking at two very, very distinct periods. Until the 1990s, you're actually looking at a completely different state organization with the Soviet Union. And post that, you're looking at the Russian Federation. So before the breakdown of the Soviet Union, we see that Mikhail Gorbachev is actually trying to bring liberalization to the Soviet Union, which until then was a completely communist state. This was done in part because the Soviet economy had a major dearth of consumer goods, which meant that people did not know or did not have places where they could spend their money and keep the economy rolling. We can see this in the graph presented as well. Gorbachev attempted to counter this by using a two-stemmed approach. These involved the ideas of terms known as perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika meant restructuring, while glasnost meant openness. The main purpose of these was to catch up with their Western counterparts. Again, we need to put this in context because this is also the period of the Cold War. They wanted to make it a more efficient industry and a semi-free market system to keep up with globalization and keep up with their Western counterparts. However, the market mechanisms did not integrate with the existing institutions that were in place. The move instead shocked the economy, and there were limitations on free speech also, and this really increased the people's dissatisfaction with the government and with government methods as well. Moving forward to the 1990s, so can we just go back to the previous slide? Yeah. Then in the 1990s, what we see is Boris Yeltsin undertaking an ambitious liberalization program with a vouchers program and a loan for shares program. Under these programs, what we see is that people were given vouchers that they could use to buy shares in public sector companies. And the government would also take loans from businessmen in exchange for shares in public companies. Both these measures actually ended up exacerbating people's dissatisfaction, and the moves resulted in increased inequality, and the power and money rested with big businessmen, and ended up create an oligarchy in essence that we see that is present even today. Now, moving on to Brazil, Brazil's experiments with liberalization begin much earlier than the other states. Getio Vargas adopts the import substitution program in the 1930s. But the major program that we see is in the 1960s under Juscelino Kubitschek. He introduces something that comes to be known as the 50-year and 5-year program, which essentially meant he was trying to achieve 50 years worth of social and economic progress in 5. Both these measures hinged on industrialization as a driver for growth and inclusion. the adoption of import substitution, industrialization, and private bids for the inception of Brazil's automobile industries. The major effort to liberalize Brazil's economy came in the 1990s under Itamar Franco. He introduced something that came to be known as Plano Real. This was majorly due to the high rates of inflation that we see in the graph during the periods of the 1980s. The Plano Real included an exchange rate appreciation, reduction in tariffs, the introduction of a crawling peg, and privatization of many state-owned companies. Finally, Brazil's current president, Lula da Silva, who was elected last year, had a major hand in the experiments of liberalization as well. He tried to balance his welfare background with the economic needs of the country and introduced plans such as Bolsa Familia. Now, moving on to the next sort of thing that we see is the impact of corruption. Corruption is often the trigger in the case studies that we see. The first country that we look at is India. In India, we see that despite UPA 1 and the UPA 2's above average performance in terms of improvement of social and economic indices, corruption allegations and scandals essentially acted as their downfall. Each corruption scandal led to a shift in people's perceptions, especially in the middle and upper income sections, as you can see in the diagram that's been provided. These groups had benefited from liberalization methods that India had undertaken in the 1980s and 90s, and as a result were more aspirational in terms of their expectations from a government. Therefore, when the UPA, which was led by a party such as the INC, highlighted the existing corruption in the system, the people were hungry for a change, which was then leveraged by the NDA to launch Narendra Modi into the limelight. Now, moving to Turkey, what we can see is that the people were exhausted by the continuous economic flux in the 1990s, and they would not be swayed by just religious representation in politics. The fact is that major leadership and established leaders were embroiled in corruption scandals as the Lost Bank scandal, the Turk Bank scandal, etc. And there was a leadership vacuum that was left for a leader, and that created a want in public for a leader that had economic goals as well. It was not enough for a leader to just resonate with people's people's religious sentiments, but also represented their economic wants as well. Now, moving on to Russia, in the case of Russia, unlike our other case studies, there's no specific instance or scam that can be pointed towards. However, systemic corruption was on the rise in the country, as you can see in the graph. The downfall of the economic measures was essentially had major impact on corruption as well. It increased corruption, and there wasn't much forethought put into this, and these programs actually resulted in an increase in income inequality. This was because measures like Loan for Shares program and the voucher program actually gave rise to the Russian oligarchy and an increase in the sort of middleman culture. The people who felt that they had a hand in building the Soviet economy prior, which formed the base of the Russian Federation, saw only the rich benefiting from the economic measures that were brought in by Yeltsin. Yeltsin declining health and sort of international disregard did not help and led to a loss of confidence, essentially. The next country that we see is Brazil. Even though corruption has been prevalent within sort of the government establishment system in Brazilian society for a while, it was not until the Petrobras scandal that people were forced to come maybe face to face with the extent of corruption that was prevalent in the society. The scandal itself saw Brazil lose about $27.1 billion, which is close to about 1% of Brazil's GDP. This led to the downfall of existing politicians and made way for a politician who usually blended into the background until that moment. Now, the next thing that we see is the role of religious conservatism within society. Amidst the economic changes and corruption acting as a catalyst, there's also an underlying social factor that plays an impact in each of these countries to a different degree. Now, religion has always played a major part in India, Turkey, and Brazil, in the country's politics as well. In India, looking at the Congress's composition from a very early day, you see that politics has been, the politics was very heterogeneous. Once the party sort of lost motivation to collaborate with other social compositions within the country after the independence, it gave rise to an erstwhile Janata Party, and eventually what came to be known as the BJP. Like India, Turkey is also quite a religious society. However, bringing religion to politics was frowned upon until Ataturk's death. Since Ataturk's death, the prominent ideology, Kemalism, had very little space in politics. As a result, political parties uh, were more outwardly religious and were sort of catering to the conservative parts of society as well. It is also one of the platforms on which Erdogan and the AK party come to power. The next two countries that we saw on the list is Russia and Brazil. In Russia, what we see is an increased interdependence between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state. As you can see in the graph, what we also see is more people uh, 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 describing themselves as Orthodox Christians in an erstwhile atheist state, which is a huge change since the 2000s, especially. In Brazil, what we see is the Catholic Church playing a huge role in making the country, number one, democratic in the late 80s and 90s. What we also see is an increase in religious conservatism in the 2000s. There's been an increase in people who've described themselves as evangelical Christians since 2003, and eventually it also helped give rise to Jair Bolsonaro. Now, looking at leaders, while talking about the leaders, the first thing that we see is them maybe positioning themselves as outsiders to the system. But what we can see is, so move on to the next slide, maybe. Yeah, what we see is they had political ambitions from a very early stage. They also held public office at some point in their career. With all the leaders, Narendra Modi, Tayyip Erdogan, Vladimir Putin, Jair Bolsonaro, what we see is that they come from lower middle class backgrounds, but they have political ambitions from a very early age and want to join the government establishment in some way. Narendra Modi joins the RSS, then becomes a member of the BJP. The Rath Yatra becomes a sort of catapult for him, and he eventually rises up to become Gujarat Chief Minister. The UPA's downfall eventually acts as a catalyst, and he becomes Prime Minister. In the case of Tayyip Erdogan, he becomes an active member in the sort of social conservative political movement in Turkey in the 1980s. He eventually rises up to become mayor of Istanbul in the 90s, and in 2003, with the leadership vacuum that has been created due to the lack of confidence with other leaders, he uses that as a platform and becomes prime minister and president. A similar thing we see with Vladimir Putin. He joins the KGB at a very early age. With the downfall of the Soviet Union, he decides to get into the government establishment, eventually rises up to become mayor, deputy mayor, and then rises up to become prime minister and president. What we also see is a change in trajectory of Russia under Vladimir Putin, what analysts are now calling a guided democracy. Guided democracy essentially is a country where they tend to follow democratic norms outwardly, but they are increasingly autocratic and authoritarian within. Again, similar to these three leaders, Jair Bolsonaro at a very early age joins the military. Once he leaves military in the late 80s, early 90s, he joins active politics and is a member of the lower house of their legislature, the equivalent to the Lok Sabha in India, and is a member of it until the late 2000s, where post the Petrobras scandal, there's a leadership vacuum created, and he uses his military background and his Catholic background to essentially catapult him to become the head of state. In 2022, he loses the elections, however, to Lula da Silva. Now, where are these countries today? India expects to go to elections in May 2024. Turkey is going to have elections next month. According to the opinion polls, Erdogan might lose the elections. Right now, he's down by 10 points. Again, opinion polls vary, but at least according to what is being seen, a coalition of 6 opposition parties are trying to come together and essentially remove him from power. One of the platforms that they are actually contesting on is removing a lot of the power that Erdogan gave the presidential office while he was in power, and take it away and give it back to the legislature. What we see is the Ukraine-Russian conflict entering its second stage. What we also see during this part in Russia, especially, is an increase in religious conservatism and the use of religious conservatism within by the Russian state to justify its actions in Ukraine. We see the close relationship between the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, who's a former member of the KGB himself, and Vladimir Putin. Kirill actually called called Ukraine a sort of member of the Russian fatherland, and so on. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil lost the 2022 presidential elections to Lula. However, according to opinion polls, he still has a very high rating, and if there were going to be elections held, he might win the elections, the upcoming elections. Now, key takeaways, I think I'll bring Professor Deepanshu back into it.
Yeah, so I'll just, because we're short on time, I'm going to take a couple of quick minutes to give you a sense that, as we had mentioned earlier while I was discussing the pyramid, the 3 key axis points we are discussing largely here for the context of the research in the book, because, as you know, it's an ambitious project looking at the diversity of each of the countries' own socio-political history and the context in which each of the leaders are coming into power, and what they're using as a force or sort of a mobilizing force to sustain power. There is clearly a common link between the sort of premature attempted reform packages that were sort of introducing different kinds of neoliberal / supply side economic reforms. There were certain groups that really benefited out from these reforms, which led over a period of time to sort of pro-market skewed tendencies. But over a period of time, a few communities, particularly the low middle income groups, failed to see the degree of upward mobility, at least on economic opportunities, for a period of time, which created a discontentment trying to look for an alternative imagination of power. And most of the leaders that you see that we've highlighted come from a certain grouping that they've used that identity of where they come from. Like Modi talks quite many times, in fact, in the 2014 poll about his social and economic identity, and sort of him being a chaiwala and coming and knowing and understanding the pain that low middle income groups and low income groups face. At the same time, you have corruption as the factor which is really important in understanding what's really triggering that mass sort of movement against the ruling elite and the change in the status quo. In some cases, the 2008 crisis, as I said, was changing the status quo in many countries in the industrially developed world. But in much of the case studies, we've seen that 2008 itself is not, the starting point. There are many other factors that is driving towards the changes that we see today. So some of these factors are important to note, right? Now, just to conclude, the key questions that, and this is emerging going back to the same context of the pyramid we looked at, is that the contested nature of relationships that we see between, whether you see with populism, hyperglobalism, authoritarianism, welfareism, and majoritarianism, is context, of course, dependent. To more case studies, Russia's case is more complex because we do see a higher sense of a degree or resonance of authoritarianism, which is explaining much of its populist pivot. But at the same time, if you look at cases of Turkey, India, and Brazil, we do see different aspects triggering and allowing for that ideological populism movement. At the same time, we are looking to now sort of look at more case studies, which sort of help and understand what works for leaders. In a certain sense, the link between populism and authoritarianism or welfarism is a complex one. In certain small nation states, demographically small, as in speaking, there has been evidence that you've seen some of these political movements working well for the leader in power. That the move towards a centralizing figure or a cult personality works well. India's particularly had that at very different periods of time in post-independent history, right from Nehru to Indira Gandhi to Rajiv to Modi, or even Atal Bihari Vajpayee to a certain extent. There has been this tendency of seeing that one sort of centralizing figure at the center who would be seen as very critical. But whether that person uses or weaponizes institutions to centralize power or sort of usurp power is something which is more context dependent to what we are seeing now. We do mention this, but I personally feel there is a lot more work required on the psychoanalytical side of looking at strongman leaders. There's a lot of common parallels. In the interest of time, we didn't talk about it much here, but if you look at the early life experience of each of the leaders we have talked about, there is a similarity in the way in which their family life or the discontentment seen at home or the intra-household level is a key factor in shaping the way they sort of become the leaders that they ultimately became, and sort of their pivot towards a sort of a spiritual, religious belief system is emergent from the kind of life they led at the first sort of 20, 25 years. And this is something which requires more work. I mean, from the training, the lack of training of the discipline psychology, we left it to more qualified scholars, but there is clearly a case. And lastly, the need for understanding how the elite behavior is changing is something I think we have to get a better sense of. There is a clear movement and response to current wave of populism where a new emergence of a new form of an elite is happening. From the business spectrum, from the economic spectrum, from the political spectrum, we see that change very much happening. And as researchers, we have to be humble to experimenting with methods. I've mentioned this at the beginning of the talk itself. We don't have existing methods that give us a very good sense of what's happening. There's similar ways to explore intersectionality in terms of involving other disciplines or involving other methods to understand and provide a more nuanced perspective in populism. With that, we'd like to pause here and sort of open the conversation up for any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhinav and Deepanshu, for a very interesting presentation on a very important topic. Perhaps we could kickstart questions with a few of our own. One is, while you get a sense from the presentation that while the book does address a range of factors that could explain the rise of this 21st century populism, it seems to me at least that you kind of place central focus, or rather one of the main focuses on the economic factors. What happened after liberalization, what happened after globalism, etc. I know there are many studies of the rise of populism. I just wonder, what you feel about what Pranab Bardhan has spoken about, that, the earlier we talk about economic inequality. It's not inequality that is driving these, and he's a bit more careful in using the term populism, but driving this tendency, let's say. But he talks about insecurity, where you bring in both economic as well as social, religious, etc., which are as important as the economic. I wonder what you think about that. I know there are, you do say that this is there is so much more research to be done, etc. But if we place some central importance to the economic, I wonder whether we will miss out the perhaps equally important social and religious factors, because the economic resentment now seems vastly different than that which was experienced, across the world in the 70s and 80s. That's my starting observation. Perhaps Vikram will have something to say, or yeah.
To add
Vikram,
to
look
what
at- yeah.
Ram said, I would also like to know whether the increasing right-wing populist thing is actually a failure of democracy across the countries. I mean, are we talking about that democracy itself is a 200-year-old idea, and maybe people don't want democracy, and they like authoritarianism, they like heroes, they like icons, they like symbols, and this is what is showing up in these authoritarian regimes. Is it a view which you could think of? You can answer these two, and then we will come next questions.
Fair enough. Abhinav, is it okay if I go ahead? Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, I completely agree with Ram that on the point of the rise in economic resentment or discontentment, it's central to the discussion only to the extent that my own training is in the discipline of economics, and that was one of the things initially that I was interested to look at. And when we started doing the initial research, we realized, in fact, what you're saying, that it is not economic resentment alone which is guiding much of the discussion in seeing a shift in political trajectory, so as to speak, right? And there was no axis. I mean, if you've seen the pyramid was actually a quadrant, and then that's now sort of imagined itself into sort of so many factors, the intersectionality or interlinkage of which varies from degree to degree in different countries, but each of those factors have a weight of importance, if not equal, but I think an important weight. There is, I think, somewhere a much more profound, nuanced sociological understanding of the, as I was using the word, moral and spiritual vacuum that was experienced by communities which were in a certain sense left behind by the political establishment's overall emphasis and meaning. And I say that because much of the electoral management of democratic governance, I mean, if you were to see with India or even Turkey to that extent, or Brazil, was situated around building coalitions and alliances on meeting the social security or economic security of the communities that were in power, but at the basic minimum level. Much like, I mean, in a certain sense, Modi is trying to do now with providing free ration to, communities which are sort of meeting a low-income group. But there is something else which is definitely going on. And at no point of time, in fact, in the book, you would see that there is only an emphasis on what is happening on the economic spectrum. We're talking about that because it is a key division point for certain groups to gravitate towards a certain class of leadership, as against certain groups to say, oh, what the hell is really happening? Like they're asking those questions. I know what you mean by Burden's analysis. I agree with what Dr. Burden has written in his book. I was inquisitive myself, if we were to start on the project today, again, we might have maybe used the word insecurity more in the text of analysis, having used the word of rising inequality. But I do, there's a slight disagreement with his thesis that inequality itself was not a perpetuating factor, which was leading to a lot of, I think somewhere you see that insecurity had, as an outcome realization, a more functional dependence on rising inequality. When I say that, what I mean is that unions losing bargaining power, labor rights seeing themselves to marginalize over a period of time, the establishment of a ration state, the point that, in fact, Ratan Roy made in his Manthan talk, that India worked as a more of a ration state in post-independent industry. And then when the dismantling of that ration state happened, a lot of communities started feeling that inflation and high underemployment is creating those ripple effects. We have now those seismic, I think, shifts happening again. So at a state level, you see that a state like Haryana or Rajasthan, or for that matter, Madhya Pradesh, wherever you see, or Bihar for that matter, wherever there is high unemployment, the natural resonance towards a certain kind of political centralizing elite force is not really happening at the same level. In fact, in all of these states, you don't see a BJP impetus moving that strongly. You see with West Bengal, for example, it's a very different dynamic, so as to speak. So the insecurity or the conceptualization of realized insecurity is functionally dependent on the rising level of social and economic inequality. And somewhere this is connected to what Vikram was saying, that the failure of democratic structures, I wouldn't use the word failure so as to say, but the limited functioning or entitlement of democratic fundamentals to give agency to communities which were not part of the decision-making space. If you see the UPA 1, for example, and we're talking about India because of sort of just for deliberative reasons, but if you look at UPA 1, there is much more focus on social security, enhancing the welfare net, as against to what you see in UPA 2. You see much of discussions in what is called as policy paralysis, delay in decision making, which is hurting communities worse than, for example, what's happening beyond. But in much of the period between 2009 and 14, in fact, much of the period between 2004 and 9, when the best period India's growth trajectory saw, and also much of its developmental indicators saw, was between 2000 and 2, 3 to 2011 and 12. That one decade has in fact been one of the better performing ones. So you see a big mixed, balanced outlook towards policy thinking, which is involving economic functionings and entitlements, but also social security is kept at that center. Somewhere, I think the welfare net, it starts getting eroded much into the period of time of UP2 because of sort of coalition government reasons, delaying decision making. And that's used as a plan for developmental opportunity by leaders, strongman leaders. So we've discussed this in the book as well, that each of the leaders, when they're coming to power initially, from Erdogan to Modi to Bolsonaro, they're all using development and vikas, right, as a way of enshrining and realizing much of economic development and social development for communities that are left behind. They're not using much of sort of religious mobilization as an explicit strategy. You see more of that happening much after they are in power, actually. So I think that's something which is important as a key point to look at. The other key area which we have, I think here in our research, we've not talked about it, but in the talks that we've had on the book so far, around 7 to 8 institutions, is this very strange myriad relationship between fiscal policy and strongman populism. And I think somewhere we need to get a better grasp of that. I think that's clearly a key research question we have on how each of the leaders have used their fiscal policy, which is very different from the left-wing populism movements of Latin America and others. They used more, if you look at Venezuela, you look at many other countries, they used much more explicit support on welfare subsidies. The excessive use of subsidies was very central to the popularity of each of the leaders. You don't see much of that happening. Even with Trump, right? For example, in the US, he's more about dismantling the social safety net than sort of standing for it. So that's something which is very interesting and unique. So on the failure of democracy point is, reflection is, I think it's more about the failure of including communities which lacked agency in much of democratic functioning of governance. And somewhere the existing political ideology, in some cases it was more central left, some ways it was more left, failed to provide that mediation or gapping, which allowed for that insecurity, or use the word sort of unequal access of opportunity, to drive the move or seismic shift towards others. Having said that, inflation, unemployment, and this rising insecurity all contribute to asking for a change in status quo or driving resentment, even against strongman leadership. So as to say that if you have what you're clearly seeing right now is a deflect and distract strategy by existing leaders, when they know that the real issues on the ground of high inflation is affecting people and communities more explicitly than the other. And you see the evidence of that in state elections, right? In India, for example, the state election results are not entirely necessarily driven by what's happening at the national level entirely. And because these issues matter a lot on the local ground. But for that kind of analysis to happen, you need with a case study, you need a intra-case study focus. We'll have to look at states per se to describe what's really happening as against talking about different countries. So because we're talking about different countries here, we were looking at an axis of influence or factors or variables that are contributing in importance to the wave of populism that you're seeing. Having said that, I think as you see and you go on with the next few years, the evidence would only provide more, I think, hypothetical reckoning to the variables identified. But we'll come back to some of these things again. I think as we move. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there's one question from the audience. I mean, you had covered it, I think, in your pyramid. But if you could briefly comment, how much has social media been used and contributed to the rise of populism in these countries? This is something that many people think about, worry about. And I think you did have it in your pyramid, but perhaps you could elaborate on it for a few minutes.
Yeah, and so can we take a couple of questions, Ram, if that's all right, and then
maybe
we just look at that.
If you could this, then later we.
On social media, I think this has to be linked with what we put in the pyramid as the weaponization of new institutions or new orders of information. I think social media generally, as most people know, technologically provides that sort of centralizing reservoir of information that can be disseminated by leaders. For example, Modi cannot or may not do a press conference, but can still connect with his confluence or aggregation of voters by using Twitter as the platform. Trump did pretty much the same thing. You see the entire Brexit campaign rallying on social media and much of the information that was spread. So the whole analysis of what is being called as the post-truth age has been questioned or brought into question with the way the information order has changed. And much like any tool can be used, I mean, we can use a knife for surgery or murder. It's a technological tool of the information order, the way we see it now, has been weaponized by the populist leaders for not only just ascertaining power, but also for, in many cases, distracting and deflecting on issues that may otherwise affect their ability to control a sustained power. And I think that's something which is very interesting to look at as well. In case of, for example, a state like China, where you see a different kind of surveillance capitalism. We've used the word surveillance capitalism as a way of a new phenomenon where you have resources of capital being utilized through technological mediums to surveil citizenry, and particularly pockets of citizenry and groups, to ensure that they do not sort of meet or challenge the interests of those in power. So the compatibility of interest of those who are at a certain level, whether they're in civil society, whether they're in certain levels of representation, to check the government in power, though they're not allowed to do that because they're being surveilled and made sure that they are not allowed that space to challenge. And the other key factor with social media is the fact that I think somewhere the use of information overload, that is excessive information on a certain issue to polarize debates and rhetorically create different axes, I think is being used much more, which was never, really the case, as we would have seen a decade before this. Anytime before 2000s, you would have not seen a similar trend. So that's new. And that's something which we have sort of mentioned about here.
There's another question here on to counter a strong man. Is there a need for a strong man in the opposition?
Sorry, and to add to that, there's another question from a different perspective on the same issue. Is there alternative, another strong man, or a relatively weak leader with shared power? I think what it means is coalition of interests. So we have two questions on the same topic, but with different perspectives, let's say. Yeah.
Abhinav, you want to respond to that? Whether you need...
Yeah. I don't think there's a need for another strongman in opposition to counter a strongman. I think there's a need for strong opposition. I think you see this to address the second question. I think you see something very similar in Turkey right now, where you have a coalition of maybe 6 or 7 parties that are coming together in order to fight against a strongman. And if you look at the opinion polls, they're actually doing quite well, and they might actually win the upcoming elections that are going to be conducted next month.
So it's interesting, just very quickly, because Israel, as you know, had this thing with Netanyahu, and a coalition of opposition parties came together, and somehow it didn't sort of work. And you see now Netanyahu back in action. I think to sort of have a safe response out of it, looking at what is really important, is the quality of institutions that allow opposition to have a role. Is the test out there. If you do have, I mean, Russia has had opposition leaders who have been jailed, poisoned, and the quality of institutions do not allow for that kind of a strong opposition to emerge itself. And that creates a lot of difficulties for, a counter sort of a figure to be coming in, emerging. So the function of having a strong leader in opposition who can gravitate and mobilize masses against a strongman is, I think, a function of the nature of institutions, or the way the institutions are left, in what state are they left after that strongman populism wave has sort of spread through. It's like, a tornado has passed by, and you have a city which is completely demolished. So you'll have to start completely new. And I think with certain countries, with India, we're clearly moving to a different trajectory. And I think another 5 years of very similar sort of a rule by law, so as to speak, may leave very little for the opportunity for a good or a strong opposition to emerge.
Would you think that the absence of a mature political elite is responsible for rise of populism, and they need training more than the poor about the values of being less populist?
So, sorry. Yeah, no, I think I agree. But when you say responsible, I think the way you would put responsibility would be in how, as a function of responsibility, how transparent and accountable an existing political elite was to to the communities that you were sort of appropriating, the labor of which you were appropriating. I mean, look at the migrant worker crisis, for example, right? Just to give you a reference, during the lockdown, how Swedes and many millions of low-income migrant workers were left in disarray. And a lot of the conditions of the low-income migrant workers that live in the urban spectrums today, the condition of that was not created in a matter of few years, right? It's the system which over a period of time failed to provide safeguards and mechanisms. And it's that group and community which has sort of had very little expectations, quote unquote, from the state or the government. So when they see, for example, in the rural area, a bridge or a road which is being constructed, for us, infrastructure may mean very little because we know what kind of ideological backing it is coming in. Larry Summers, for example, just made this point. I don't know if you heard one of his recent interviews, that he's saying that the US is having that real challenge right now in the global sort of influence of the world order, where someone he was talking to in a seminar said that, you talk to China and you get a bridge, you talk to the US, you get a lecture, right? So a lot of the ability of, or the inability of the establishing order of an hegemonic force, right, whether you call it the political elite or the economic elite, failed at some point of time to provide that agency to communities that were already losing meaning and relevance. And I think that was appropriated entirely with this alternative imagination of power. And the same grouping is now losing touch with the same group. If you look at, for example, the communities, which is for example, in the Indian context, the Dalits, the Ambedkarites, the movements of, let's say, workers, civil society, many of the groups which were otherwise mobilized to counter against an establishment of the failure of the existing political elite are now again standing at a spectrum. So the next political class of leadership which emerged has to, sort of gravitate mobilization around these groups to be able to, challenge the existing strongman leadership. Unless you're able to not do that, I don't think that you'll have an opposition which can really test the waters there.
Vikram, there's one more question. Are governments doomed to oscillate between strongmen and democratic principles? Has there, I mean, I don't know has there been one country with a history of no strongmen? Well, I mean.
So there is gravitation and oscillation between these two forces. I get where the questioner is coming from, that, is this a part of a, like you use in economics and business, a cycle, right? There's a cyclical force that over a period of time is happening. So yes, there are, I think demographics really play a very important role in the quality of the social political polity as well. If you would have noticed, all the case studies we have picked are largely relatively large domestic market center studies. If you were to look at smaller countries, right, I think that generally somewhere authoritarian or strongman leadership has worked better. I mean, look at Southeast Asia or much of the ASEAN members. The best phases of economic growth seen in countries are those at the time when they were ruled by certain form authoritarian leaders. Park Chung-hee, South Korea, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, Hun Sen, Cambodia, a strongman, almost uncontested in power for so long, and it's one of the fastest growing economies. So I think geography really matters in order to respond to the question that you're asking, and also the way the mobilization of social politics has happened in that particular country. So I don't know to what extent, for example, France or Sweden or smaller sort of Scandinavian countries would have seen trends. I don't think you would have seen that strongman notion. In the UK, when we were presenting the book for the first time before pre-publication, because the book came out in the UK and the US, their argument was that a lot of their conservative leadership is with women as strong women leaders, right? So you see Thatcher, Theresa May, Liz Truss, a lot of them being on the more conservative leg. So there's I think a question of geography, a question of the politics of social mobilization or political mobilization that happened, which led them to become a democracy. US is a very good example where strongman leadership could not sustain over a period of time. The reason that there are different separation of power between the state, the legislature, the executive, and at the federal and state level didn't allow Trump to really usurp and control, to the extent that he wanted to. So we have, I think, examples where, depending on some of these factors of geography, nature of institutions, and also to a certain extent, the politics of social mobilization has shaped some countries with the history of no strongman leadership at all.
How strong is the connection between unemployment and populism? I mean, in the four nations you have studied, is there a rising unemployment and hence populist measure and populism and authoritarianism? Is it why it's working?
I mean, I'll take that one. Labor resentment has been on the rise with each of the leaders that we have spoken about. Brazil, I think, responded to that as clearly as possible as a response to, Bolsonaro. Even though a lot of the points against the popular vote giving preference to Lula was shaped by Bolsonaro's mishandling of the pandemic. And his comments on women, a lot of those things didn't sort of go down well with him. But I think more than unemployment, the inability to acknowledge the disruptions that are happening currently in the contemporary labor market, largely as a result of massive power-based or skill-biased technological change, right, which you're seeing with the gig economy and others areas, is accentuating a new form of, I won't use the word revolution, but a new form of large base aggregated discontentment against the political elite. My sense is that the only clear main opposition whenever, as the one or the period you would see against the political strongmen that we're talking about would come, a large source of that would be the representation of this community of sort of discontentment flavor workers. Unemployment is tricky because from indicators perspective, you may have low unemployment, but you can have still massive labor resentment. I think the indicator which one would want to look at is the employment rate. As Mahesh Vyas talks about in the Indian scenario as well, the employment rate which has been in there or in function for the leaders since they have been in power, how many percentage of people looking out for active employment are actually able to find employment? And if the employment rate is moving down, I think that in itself is a matter or cause of worry, more so as the rise of unemployment per se, which is much more tracked and better tracked in industrially developed countries for better data reasons. That's it. I don't know to what extent it answers your question, but
Yeah, no,
we could have a whole lecture on labor.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, it's been a fascinating discussion of not just an important subject, but also a very contemporary one, which I think everybody is trying to make sense of across the world. And in addition to the 4 countries that you have studied, you could add Hungary, you could add Philippines under Duterte, you could add Egypt, Tunisia. The numbers seem to be only increasing. The only change, I guess, has been in Brazil, the US, and perhaps even somebody wouldn't call the UK or Boris Johnson populist. So, so thank you both for this very fascinating discussion of a very important issue I need to emphasize. And I hope you'll, expand on the book, taking further the questions that you have listed. And thank you again, for being on Manthan. And I'm sure our audience would be very interested. And for the audience, a link to the book is there to Amazon. So please, if you're interested, go ahead and get a copy for yourself. Thank you, Abhinav. Thank you, Deepanshu. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you, Deepanshu and Abhinav. Thank you for being on Manthan.
Thank you, Vikramji, and thank you, Ram. Thank you so much.